Hello students, and thank you for joining me for this presentation on business letters. Make sure that you've gone into the Blackboard site and printed the example of the black letter that is provided in the Blackboard site. That will help you as we go through this presentation. Typically, business letters are sent outside of the organization. Most emails and memos are sent within an organization, although emailing to outside contacts is obviously increasing as the preferred communication method. Letters hold a degree of formality and serve as a representation of the writer, the person who types the letter, and the organization. Sometimes the person who signs the letter is the same as the person who types it, and sometimes not. So what is your responsibility regarding composing and typing up business letters? Well, you are responsible for the appearance of the letter to make sure that it follows good format. And we want to look at things such as paragraphing and obviously correct punctuation, spelling, and we're going to be talking about different letter parts and using those parts correctly in a letter. As a medical administrative professional, you may be provided with a Post-it note with rough handwritten points to include in a letter and then asked to compose the letter into a professional message. When I supported doctors, very frequently they would stop by my desk and just verbally ask me to compose a letter for their signature and tell me what the letter should include. Some doctors and medical offices still dictate their correspondence and then ask their administrative professionals to transcribe the letters. Or it may be your job that you compose letters and sign them yourself. So in any case, no matter how you are approached to write a business letter, the letter needs to follow a special format, and we're going to look at that next. Chapter 6 of our textbook does cover business letters. I'm not a real fan of some of the letters that they have out there, so please refer to the example in Blackboard. That is the only format that we will use in this class. We'll use a block format, and then in a couple of weeks here we will do a modified block. But again, always refer to the examples provided in Blackboard because they are the correct samples for business technology courses. Some of your other courses may use these examples, so I want to make sure that you are taught the correct format for your other classes here. Some of the formatting in Chapter 6, quite honestly, is just outdated. So just a caution there, use what's in Blackboard. While we want to write concisely, be careful that all paragraphs aren't only one sentence each. This looks and reads really choppy and gives the reader the impression that you composed it as quickly as you could to just get it off your plate. Many times, perhaps maybe our closing paragraph might be one sentence, and maybe even the introduction, but we do want to be careful that not all of our paragraphs are just one sentences. On the other hand, we obviously don't want one huge paragraph in the middle of our letter, so just watch those things as you compose your letters. This week we will cover the block letter style. This is the most frequently used style in organizations. It's the most streamlined, it's the most efficient because all letter parts start at the left margin, and we should have a 1-inch margin on the left and right. So don't change your margins to try to fit things on a page. Again, refer to the example in Blackboard for our block letter style. In a few weeks, we will cover a different style called the modified block style. This is a more traditional, older style of letter, and it is different because the date line, complimentary close, and the writer's name and title in our signature block starts at the center point. It's not center aligned, it's tabbed to the center. So we will cover this in a couple of weeks here. Again, at that point, I will provide a sample in Blackboard. At this point, though, we're going to concentrate on that block style. Not only do we have a choice about letter format, either using the block format or the modified block format, we also have a choice about what type of punctuation style to use in letters. So standard or mixed punctuation is the same thing, just referred differently. Standard or mixed uses a colon after the salutation and a comma after the complimentary close. So only in those two letter parts are we talking about here. The rest of the letter is punctuated per business punctuation rules. So Dear Dr. Jones, colon. Dear Kathy, colon. Dear Ms. Whitcomb, colon. So in our salutation there, notice it's a colon, not a comma, in our business letters. The other part of the letter that we're referring to is the complimentary close. That's at the end of the letter when we're closing the letter. Very true, or yours very truly, comma, sincerely, comma, sincerely yours, comma. You get the idea. Okay, so only in these two letter parts are we talking about with this mixed punctuation. So this, what I just talked about, is called the standard or mixed punctuation style. Our second choice in punctuation style is called open punctuation, and this is where no punctuation is used after the salutation and no punctuation is used after the complimentary close. So for example, Dear Mrs. Hanson. Notice there's no colon there at all. Dear Sally is just open, no colon. Same thing with that complimentary close. Sincerely yours, no comma. So whatever style we choose or whatever style our organization wants, we need to be consistent. If you don't put a colon after the salutation, do not put a comma after the complimentary close. That's the biggest thing. Stay consistent. For your assignments, I will either tell you to choose a style or I will assign a specific punctuation style. So please keep that in mind. Letters consist of many parts, and some of these parts are mandatory and some are only used as needed. So here is a list of the mandatory letter parts that need to be included in every business letter. Letterhead needs to be a dateline. We're going to have an inside address, salutation, the body of the letter, complimentary close, a typed signature line or signature block, and reference initials. We're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. Business letters are printed on professional letterhead, so that's the type of paper that we would use when we're going to print out a letter. The first typed line is the date line, which is keyed a few blank lines down from the letterhead, and you can see the example in Blackboard. And this is where if we have a letter that's almost onto a second page, we can maybe delete a line there. We obviously don't want to be right up on the letterhead, but this is an area where we can have a little bit of play if necessary. Notice that the date in a business letter is spelled out, October 22nd, comma, 2000, whatever. So we're going to spell out the month. Notice we do not abbreviate the month. We do not use an ordinal number like 22nd, that ND, do not use that. Or the third, RD, don't use that. We're not going to use those. That's called an ordinal number. We're not going to use them. Also, we do not type out dates with the slash marks, such as this example on the slide, like 10/22/2000XX. We always spell out the date in a letter. It's a little different than medical documentation that you may be doing in your healthcare documentation class. Those we do use those typed out figures, but in a business letter, we're going to spell out the month. After the date line, our next mandatory letter part is the inside address. This is who the letter is going to. Who is it going to be mailed to? Again, see the example in Blackboard for the placement of this. And note that an inside address can consist of 3 or more lines, kind of depending on titles and organizations and departments. The bigger the organization, the more lines you may need to get to that person, such as the example that I show here of myself. Spell out street designations and directions. So street, S-T-R-E-E-T, drive, D-R-I-V-E. Spell those out. And use 2-letter state abbreviations in an inside address, such as Wisconsin, W-I, Florida, F-L. You get the idea. And in fact, a 2-letter state abbreviation reference may be a great addition to your information stations binders that you are putting together. Moving down our letter to the next mandatory letter part is our salutation. We use a formal salutation in business letters. Use the personal and professional title and the last name, such as Dear Mrs. Spahn, Dear Dr. Wu, Dear Professor Fine, Dear Ms. Whitcomb. You get the idea, right? This is used to show respect when we're writing to someone that we don't personally know. It's always better to go more formal than too casual in your salutations. Note also, if you don't know if a woman is married or not, always use Ms., MS. And in fact, you can just always do Ms., MS, because that is the safest way to go. And again, note that typically our first name is not included in a salutation. We normally don't say, Dear Ms. Kathy Spahn. Okay, we usually just do the title and the last name, Dear Ms. Spahn. If you do know someone very well and you are comfortable, you can do more of an informal salutation, such as Dear Raleigh, Dear Amy, just with dear and then the first name. But again, use this with caution. Obviously, each letter needs to have the body of the letter, which is our next mandatory part. We single space the lines in the body of a letter and make sure that we paragraph appropriately. We kind of talked about that earlier. We put a blank line between paragraphs. So again, look at the example in Blackboard for how that will be formatted. Do not indent your paragraphs. This is an old style, typically not used in organizations unless, of course, your employer really wants you to, but we do not typically indent our paragraphs. Note that bullets and numbers can be used for lists or to clarify information as necessary. Just a quick note about paragraphing. We do paragraph when we change our topic. So we're going to paragraph correctly. Regarding patient correspondence, if a doctor is dictating to another doctor, which does happen quite frequently, typically they will follow the SOAP format, which I'm sure you've learned in your healthcare documentation class, or you will learn. And this is in regards to the subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. And we would paragraph between each of those parts. Then we always do have an appropriate introduction to our letter and a conclusion. And many times, if you are actually transcribing from a dictator, paragraphs are not dictated. So that is up to you to decide where the appropriate paragraphs would be placed. We always close our business letter with a complimentary close, and this is found below the last line of the body of the letter. We capitalize the first letter of the first word only. So notice the very truly yours on this slide. Very is capitalized, truly and yours is not. Note the different punctuation style examples that I've shown here too as well regarding that comma after it or just leaving it open. After typing our complimentary close, we need to have a typed signature line, or sometimes referred to as a signature block. So you can see the example here. We need a couple of blank lines here because the writer will actually sign their name here. So we need room for them to sign. And again, look at the example in Blackboard for how many blank lines to have here. Note also that if you are really close to going on to another page, a line can be deleted here if necessary to try to keep everything in one page, but we want to use that cautiously with making sure that we have enough room for that person to sign. The signature block may have 2 or more lines as shown here. It might only have just the line, Paula Johnson, MD. So just be aware of that, and if you are typing for someone else, they will let you know what they would like in their signature block. Reference initials are the initials of the typist and or the writer and are another mandatory part of every letter. We place this below the signature block. If you are composing a letter for someone else that's going to sign the letter that isn't you, you probably will be also including their initials. Even if they tell you, hey, write me a letter for my signature, you would put their initials and then your initials as shown here on the slide as an example here. Note that on our examples in the book or when we have an assignment, I placed XX there. Replace that with your own initials when you're doing your assignments. All right, we've talked about all the mandatory parts that need to be placed on every business letter. Let's look at some optional letter parts. The enclosure notation, a copy notation, a postscript, an attention line or a subject line or a reference line. We're going to look at each one of these more closely and note that we will only use these as our specific letter indicates, and we're only going to use them when necessary. So just to reiterate, these are optional parts of the letter. They may not be found on all letters. It would be very unlikely that every single option would be on every letter. So use them sparingly as needed. Reference lines or subject lines are sometimes used in business letters. Note that they are not always used, so be aware of that. Your employer would let you know if a reference line should be used, but note that they are pretty common in medical correspondence, usually referring to a patient name or an insurance claim number, or it might have the patient name and a medical record number included on it, something so that whoever is getting this letter can quickly see what it is referring to and be able to look that person up if it is a patient. So check with your employer. If you're going to use a reference line, it is placed after the salutation. So, dear Dr. Graff, regarding Kimberly Bates, just as an example. Or here's an example here too of how that would be formatted. RE is what we use for reference. Capital R, capital E, colon, and then in just this example here, it's a patient, Helen Jackson, tabbed in medical record number, and we would want to align that information if we're using a two-line reference line here. As another example, if there's a subject, it would be in all caps with a colon and then our information after it, and the first letter of every word of that information would be capitalized. So again, not used in all correspondence. If you do use it, place it after the salutation. The enclosure notation is one of the more common notations that is used as an optional letter part, and this just calls attention to the inclusion of something that is included with the letter. And normally within the body of the letter, it is referred to. So it might be something like, enclosed, please find the operative note. Something like that. If you hear that when you're typing or you're typing something and you see that, enclosed, I have enclosed, I would stop, do a couple of enters, and type enclosure. That way you won't forget to put it on and then format it later. So here are just a few examples of how an enclosure notation might look, such as typed out enclosure, or if we have a couple of them, we might put the number there. We might actually list what is enclosed. So again, it's just to kind of remind the reader that something should be included with the letter, as well as the person who is putting the letter in the envelope to not forget to put something in there. So that's the enclosure notation used if we have something to enclose with our letter. Some letters will have a copy notation, and before we talk about that, first of all, note that always a copy is made of each original letter and kept on file, either electronically or in an actual file drawer. This is called the file copy, and we do not need to note this on our letter because that's assumed. It's assumed that your organization is going to have a copy of everything that you send out. So sometimes we have additional copies that will be distributed to other people, maybe other doctors or insurance companies, the patient, or whoever. Those are the copy notations that would be noted on the original, and we'll look at that notation next. Here's an example of how that copy notation would look. It is found if below the signature line, or if there's an enclosure, it goes after the enclosure notation. Notice that it's a lowercase c, colon, and a copy notation must have a name following it so that we know who it went to. Many times organizations also put in the actual address right there too. So just to keep that in mind, and your employer will let you know if that's how they would like it to be done. Because it's the lowercase c, note that Word's autocorrect will try to change this when you hit the space bar. You need to go back and reformat it as lowercase. Let's look at the optional postscript notation here. This would be the PS that maybe you've seen on letters. In the past, when correspondence was typed on a typewriter and before the wonderful world of word processing software, postscript notations were pretty common. If a writer or a dictator forgot to mention something earlier in the letter, a postscript notation or a PS was noted at the bottom of the letter and the missing information was typed there. This eliminated the need to completely retype the letter or use a lot of messy correction fluid. Now, in this day and age, a postscript notation is a deliberate attention getter to make sure something has been read. So use them sparingly. They're not used very often. It is always the last notation of the letter. So our example here, P.S. It was great to see you at the conference last month. That would be just kind of an example of what a postscript might look like. We will cover formatting two-page letters in a few weeks, but I'll introduce it here. Medical and business correspondence can be lengthy. If we have a letter that's going to be going on to a second page or a third page or whatever, we are going to use plain paper for those continuation sheets. We don't use letterhead on second or other pages. We use plain paper. Letterhead is only used on the first page. For all continuation sheets, we must have a heading that links it to the first page in case it would get separated from the first page for some reason. Note that if our letters are going on to a second page, we do not want to try to cram everything onto one page, okay? You do not change the margins to be smaller than an inch. And you do not size the font smaller than 11-point font. Even 11-point can be kind of difficult to read. So keep those things in mind. If you need to go onto a second page, that's fine. You need to make a page break at the correct page. And note that at least 2 lines of the body of the letter must be moved on to the second page. We can't just have a closing or an enclosure notation or anything like that on a second page. You must have at least 2 lines of the actual body of the letter on the second page. Let's look at the heading next. The heading on a second page letter starts at the top margin left, and if it is regarding a patient, we will use the example shown here, RE colon and then the patient's name. Hit enter, page 2 or 3 or 4, whatever the page is, hit enter and then your date. Again, we're going to spell out the date. If our correspondence does not regard a patient, it's not medical, then in place of the patient's name, we would put the person receiving the letter. So if Dr. Mann is the one who's in the inside address going to be receiving this letter, that's how we would format the heading for that letter. Thanks again for joining me today, and I hope this presentation has provided you with some clarification of how to write a professional business letter and how and when to use the different letter parts. Be sure to refer back to this presentation in the next few weeks as we continue to focus on writing letters, and refer to the examples and include them in your information station binders for reference in future classes and on the job. Have a great week, everyone.